Apparently some of the earliest use of cacao may have actually involved the pulp and not the beans.
Why did we look at this plant and decide that's the plant?
A name that is familiar to us, Rosemary Joyce.
Yes.
Now, if you all recall, in Lost City of the Monkey God, she was the villain, I would say. And we were skeptical, very skeptical of the villain status.
So a lot of our traditional witch iconography comes from women brewers.
This is a little more of a wild ride than some of our previous chapters.
Yeah.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Harenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, hello, everybody.
And today we are finishing up the book Ancient Brews by Patrick E. McGovern. And yeah, I think we've got a lot of interesting stuff to talk about this time. But before we get to that, we have a little housekeeping to do. If you are listening to this or watching this, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, leave a comment, whatever is appropriate for your platform. It really helps get the word out, and we like to see that kind of feedback from folks too. We like to hear from y'all. Also, if you'd like to support what we do at FPAN and this podcast, there will be a link to a donation page in the comments. If you are able to, please consider leaving a donation. If you are not, then likes and subscribes and that kind of thing actually helps us out a ton too. So we appreciate whatever help you can give us. And one more thing you'll find in the description section is a survey that we would like you to please consider filling out for us. We are doing a little assessment of the program and if it's effective and reaching the people we want to reach and everything. So please consider doing that. That really helps us out, and it should only take 5 to 8 minutes. So without further ado, let's jump into Chapter 7 of Ancient Brews. This one is titled Theobroma, a sweet concoction to stir romance. And so this one is all about coca and the kind of the culture around that. And there's a lot going on. I knew it was culturally significant and complicated, but there's, a lot of stuff here I hadn't heard of before, and this is pretty fun.
Yeah, this was kind of a cool chapter. I mean, obviously, big fan of chocolate, so a chocolate beer sounds delicious. This is actually, I think, one of the few that I've tried.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of neat to read the backstory.
And one thing I'm finding with his chapters is he's not the best at the preambles setting up his ideas. He kind of goes off the rails sometimes. And we've noticed this before, but I hadn't really observed the pattern until this round.
I feel like this was the first chapter where I kind of got a tad bit annoyed.
There were a few cases.
Yeah.
So we start off talking about the peopling of the Americas. He says 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. And it's kind of an odd mix of outdated information and updated information that would have not been certain at the time. And he's talking about it with certainty.
Yeah. And it's just a weird way to set up this chapter to begin with.
Right.
I'm like, okay, I guess. It's
like one of the things he says was that the first Americans followed the inside passage along the Pacific Northwest coast by boat, which still now is very much not proven.
Right.
But he talks about it as though this is a thing that happened.
Yeah.
And that's like, we can do a little better than that. Just talk about it as one possible way. Like, it's an interesting idea, and I love to see if people can find more evidence for it. But like, we have no evidence of boats at this time period still.
Well, and I feel like this chapter starts out with a lot of speculation. The boats, and then also he starts talking about like hallucinogenic mushrooms and like stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I guess there is some evidence, historical or otherwise, that they used mushrooms, but I'm like, why are we,
right?
Why is this a thing we're talking about right now?
And he also seems to do a thing every once in a while. Sometimes he's good about it. Sometimes he does this where he confuses what is there now with what was there then.
Yeah.
No, because he starts talking about taking a class in the Pacific Northwest to sample all the fruits of that region, which is very different from what it would have been experienced by the first Americans to move into the area. Also, he lists a few things that are the fruits of the Pacific Northwest, like apples,
right,
that weren't there.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just like really odd. Also, he samples a mead at 13.4% alcohol, which so far has been established is like they didn't have any distilling processes that far back. So that also wouldn't have been something people would have experienced at this time. It's just a weird thing to throw in there, and it kind of confuses this picture he was painting.
Well, and I just thought I understand he was trying to talk about how people moved from the north down to the south, and we have a lot older sites in the south, it appears. And like, I get what he was trying to go with this, but I feel like it was kind of an info dump that was possibly unnecessary to.
Yeah, and he does this next chapter too, where the preamble isn't necessary. He could have just said the thing he wanted to say, and that would have been fine.
Yeah.
You know? And the problem is it kind of confuses what we're talking about here.
And I wonder if it's a symptom of just his enthusiasm and his understanding and not necessarily being able to interpret that for the public in kind of a succinct way.
And a couple times here, I've noticed he falls prey to the popular understanding of things. And like, it's odd because sometimes he's clearly consulting with people who have experience, and then he throws things in there that he doesn't seem to question or consult with anyone on, because anyone who is in the know on the couple of these things would have told him different.
Yeah. I mean, I do like that like he starts to discuss the women's role in traditional like fermentation and like brewing practices. Yeah, that was a big part of this one in particular. Yeah, so I was like, okay, finally, because that's kind of something I'm personally interested in. And I know I've read other books about it, so I've been like waiting patiently.
Yeah, I don't know that, I guess we always know who was doing the brewing in the other cultures we've covered so far.
Right, yeah.
And in this one, it's such a key component today, I think, and so it's pretty obviously a connection to the past that way. So we talk about the Patagonia site in Monteverde, Chile, and that's kind of one of the focus ones for this one. And one of the key pieces of evidence from this one, it was 15,000 years ago when he's talking about it at least. One of the key pieces of evidence is pieces of pre-chewed material that had apparently been spit out. And essentially, there's no direct evidence of fermentation in this time period in this place, but all the components are there for fermentation. And I think that's a reasonable thing to point out without saying for sure that they were fermenting intentionally, right?
Yeah. I was kind of curious to see where he would go with that, because as an archaeologist, I want firm evidence, and I've always kind of been one of those people that will stand on the more conservative side when it comes to making assumptions about cultures, especially without direct evidence. But I think he did a pretty decent job of sussing that out.
Yeah, and he says at the end, he talks about some of the practices and stuff. Then he says in the end that these are all just plausible stories, which is appreciated. I don't know that he always does that as strongly as I would like.
Right, but in this chapter, he seemed to be pretty firm.
He did a very good job there, at least, yeah. And then we move on to talking more about what we're talking about in this chapter. And we start with an archaeologist named John Henderson, and a name that is familiar to us, Rosemary Joyce.
Yes.
Now, if you all recall, in Lost City of the Monkey God, she was the villain, I would say. And we were very skeptical of the villain status for that. She wasn't the villain, but she was one of the villains because she was the academic.
Yeah, she was the academic who criticized a lot of what was happening.
Which, so did we.
Yes.
You know, and even in that case, she was working with what they were being told, and they were unhappy. And then we were working with what the person who thought it was wonderful was telling us, and we were still having problems. So that's, even though they were limited information in that case, they still were on point. So anyway, a much more positive take on Rosemary Joyce in this book. Actually, there are no villains in this book, are there? Oh, Big Beer. We'll get to that.
Yes.
But otherwise, as far as people goes, this is just kind of happy working with people, having fun. It's kind of cool. I like that. And I hadn't thought of that before just now. But they do some excavations in Central America and are finding various jars. And some of these jars, correct me if I've got this wrong, Barbara, but they're associated with chocolate drink.
Yeah.
And, it's not necessarily one-to-one, but this seems to be these jars are always there when chocolate is being involved. These are specialized pieces of ceramics for that purpose.
And I think, this is a good example. We always talk about how it's not just about one archaeological site. It's how all that kind of information from various excavations and studies kind of pull together. I think this chapter is a good example of how that works.
Yeah. It's also a good example of how one piece of evidence isn't enough, because yes, we found these jars are associated in the past, but the archaeologists in this case were like, this is not enough evidence on its own. They wanted to get it chemically analyzed, and that's where our author comes in.
Right.
So they get some samples, and they are actually doing this in conjunction with another lab from the Hershey Company.
I know, which I was like, oh, that's fun.
Yeah. Working with Jeff Hurst here is the guy in the Hershey Company, and they've done some sampling of potential chocolate containers in the past, and so they are excited about this possibility.
Which it's really cool to think that like Hershey chocolate has a lab that they put in a little, I mean, I guess they put in some money or resources for this type of research, which is kind of neat. I have family up in Pennsylvania, and I've never actually gone to the Hershey factory, but now I want to go.
Yeah, check out that lab.
Right, I'm be like,
and you can meet Jeff.
Yeah.
And so here they're looking for a combination of theobromine and caffeine.
Yeah.
And so those are pretty strong suggestions of chocolate. He does talk about there are a couple other plants in the Americas that naturally has caffeine. And I can see Barbara already getting worked up, but give one moment.
Yeah. Okay.
One of them is yerba mate, which is very popular in the South. It is some popularity in the North now, recently. And another one that unfortunately the author falls prey to the popular interpretation of it. So take it away, Barbara.
All right. So this is one of my, I give a presentation on plant use, and one of the plants I talk about is Ilex vomitoria, or it's Yopon holly. It is the only native source of caffeine in North America, but we find the plant throughout the Americas. And it is a plant that does, like I said, contain caffeine, and it's used in a ceremonial way. Native Americans, at least in the southeastern U.S., call it black drink. And in the book, he falls prey, like Tristan said, to a common misconception that the plant itself induces vomiting, which is incorrect. I have drank black drink numerous times. I have not once vomited because of it.
Even had nausea.
Right. Yeah. It literally has about the same amount of caffeine as a cup of green tea. And it is not the plant itself that is inducing vomiting. It's the way in which the plant is consumed. So they're fasting, they're dancing around a hot fire, they're drinking a ton of it. And if you drink just plain like hot water in that situation, it would induce vomiting. Yeah. So it was done on purpose as a ceremonial purging technique, but it's not the actual plant. It's nothing to do with any chemicals or the caffeine or anything like that in the plant that cause it. And if you've ever been to like the Outer Banks, you may have drank casina. That was Yopon holly. And it was actually the Spanish, when they came to at least Florida, they had a hard time getting coffee. So they started drinking Yopon holly tea instead because it has caffeine.
And if you want to sample it yourself, there are some online distributors now too. If you're in the Americas, at least, I can't speak for elsewhere in the world, but so you can actually get some of it and try it yourself.
Yeah, I've actually like found it on Amazon.
Yep. Yep. So yes, I had to give Barbara her moment there. I knew that was coming.
The second I read that, I was like, oh, well, hopefully he does a good job. And then he fell prey. And I was like, no,
he definitely missed the buck on that one.
Yeah.
So let's see. The site we're working with now with John Henderson and Rosemary Joyce is called Puerto Escondido. And so they get the shards from there, and they're interesting in form. So there are two different forms they're observing with this particular case. One has a very long neck, and one is something that's sometimes called a chocolate pot, or is kind of like shaped like a teapot. They think it's specialized for chocolate. And so they tested them, and sure enough, they got positive hits for theobromine, and pushes back the earliest chocolate by 600 or to 600 BC. So it was over 1,000 years in this case.
I thought this, one thing I kind of thought was funny about this chapter is because even as an archaeologist, like I understand like getting an early evidence of something is like really cool and interesting, but there does often seem to be like this competition or this battle for the earliest, as if that's the most important thing about human culture is being early, finding the earliest evidence. To me, it's one of the date of something is like one of the least interesting things about an object or, an artifact or something like that.
Yeah.
So I was just like, okay, here we go.
The author does cover that pretty well a little later in the chapter. We can go ahead and cover that now if you want. It's a good segue to it. Yeah. So only a month later, basically someone found something that was older. And I think part of the competition is not just just like academic competition. It's also, I think, regional competition because these are places that produce chocolate. And so they want to say they're the oldest.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But the author very well handles this and points out from Rosemary, Joyce, and John Henderson that this is, like you said, is the least interesting question. Also, there's not enough data to say for sure who's the first.
Right.
But really, the more interesting question is what caused humans to domesticate this plant and then dedicate whole forms of pottery to specialize to it only.
Yeah.
Like, that's a pretty massive importance and pretty significant. And that is, they're right. That is the good question.
Yeah. Yeah. I just thought it was really funny because it was like, we found it. And then a month later, like in such a short time period, I was like, ah.
Didn't matter. But like Barbara was saying before, too, that mounting evidence, if you have just one, you can have errors in that data and such. But when you got two that are pretty close, that's pretty strong evidence now. So that's good. We talk a little bit about what may have been included in the chocolate drink. And this is one that seems to have some different interpretations. Again, some long shots. He takes a long shot comparing burial traditions in China to the Americas.
Oh, I totally missed that. Nope, I do see it. Okay, I did make, yes, the turtle shell. Is that what it was?
And like, okay, you could dedicate some more time to that and I'd believe it, but just because they both saw turtles important isn't enough to really like convince me that there is some connection there, some long-term connection.
I feel like he just was trying to tie in like previous beers.
Yeah.
Or so, I don't know. It seemed kind of weird, but again, he, like I said, in this chapter, he starts to do some like exploring that I'm like, I don't know if I care for this, but
he does note that there's some ethnographic evidence from the Spanish that other things were included in the drink. However, interestingly, their chemical analysis of this really old drink, which had been way before the Spanish, didn't have any sign of additives.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess the John Henderson and Rosemary Joyce both think that those might have happened later in the process, like when you're about ready to drink it maybe or something. And I found this very interesting because apparently some of the earliest use of cacao may have actually involved the pulp and not the beans.
Yeah, I thought that was like, obviously I don't think I've ever seen a cacao plant in real life, and reading this entire chapter like thus far, I thought it was just the little bean because that's what I've known chocolate to be made of. And so I guess the pulp though contains more sugar. So it makes sense that would be used for fermentation. It's also fermentable and the beans are not. Yeah.
Which is important. But I have that right, the beans foam more? No, the pulp foams more.
The pulp
because it ferments.
Yeah.
So yes, the idea is that the beans may have come into use quite a bit later with the Mayans in particular. And judging by the chocolate pot popularity, it was like really, really popular to a certain point, and then it seemed to like disappear for a while and then maybe come back. Now it's important, and he does a good job of pointing this out. That doesn't mean that chocolate also disappeared. It just means something happened that caused things to go differently.
Yeah, I wonder, it does bring up a lot of potential like research questions for the future.
Which I enjoy.
Yeah.
He does say the long-necked vessels continued to be used until Mayan civilization, quote, collapsed and inexplicably vanished around 900 AD.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I was like, oh, I know Tristan's going to have something to say about that. I did too.
We know better than that.
Yeah, it's a poor choice of words. I think because there are still Mayan descended people and cultures.
And we know what happened. Like we don't have like, we have the general ideas of what happened and everything. And yeah, it's just an unfortunate choice of words. And like I said, falling prey to the popular narratives there again.
Yeah.
They did move later, 1300 CCE, from the teapot to a cylindrical jar. And so there's a question. A good question. Is this a change in fashion, or is there some like technical reason they changed the form? And then they get into the whole foaming thing. He cites an idea by Jeff Hurst, the guy who does the lab at Hershey. And in this case, I would really like to know Jeff's qualifications to be talking about some of this. Because all we know right now is he's maybe a chemist.
Right, yeah.
And so he thinks that the chocolate teapot wasn't good for pouring, so they must have used it as a frothing thing. And there's all these ideas on how they might have frothed it, but they've never like tested any of that.
I know, and what a cool like potential like
It's an interesting idea.
yeah, like experimental archaeology, guys. Let's do
But
it.
it's being presented as this is what I think happens.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you don't actually know. You haven't tried any of that, right? So at least, and again, as it's presented here.
And again, I wish there was like a picture of these vessels or a drawing. Just I was having a hard time. Like, okay, they said teapot, okay, but then they're like not good for pouring.
The spout is very much pointing straight up, and I see why they can say that. But the whole frothing thing, like that's like cultural interpretation. Why is a chemist doing that?
Well, and there was a lot of talk about how they would consume the froth versus the chocolate drink and inhale. Yeah, and I was like, where is this coming? Is there like ethnographic evidence? Is there experimental archaeology that was done? Like where?
And sometimes there was, and sometimes if there was, it wasn't stated, which means I don't trust it. So it's interesting. Talking about the frothing, we did kind of have a fairly wild statement by the author here too. The ancient Americans did not understand the force of gravity, but they had an empirical understanding of what it could do. I was like, what a weird thing to say.
Well, and I think it was like, we didn't maybe understand the science. We didn't call it gravity. We didn't understand, but we knew that when you like held something up, it dropped.
Right. And so why was this a necessary thing to say? Like,
yeah.
And how many of us today as average people understand the force of gravity?
Well, and like, I think it was meant to be profound, but it was like, yeah, like you said, like,
it was entirely necessary.
Obviously, things drop to the ground.
Yeah, things fall, and if you hold the thing high over, it falls faster, and it can cause frothing.
Yeah.
That's all it is. It almost comes off as like insulting, but it's not quite. Okay, that was just kind of unnecessary. Yeah. And he talks about possible religious ceremony and worldviews connected to the foam. Like we said, this felt very conjectural to me. I didn't feel like this had a lot of basis presented to us, at least.
That's what was starting to annoy me with this chapter, is like it seemed to have I mean, I know they all had some conjecture, but this one seemed to have more so. And with all that has been studied and written about the Mayan, the Aztec, the Olmec,
and chocolate,
it's like, why in this chapter was there so much speculation? I feel like there's so many people study this. There had to be somebody out there you could talk to, read their articles, something, I mean, I know he did some, like Rosemary, Joyce and stuff.
This is a little more of a wild ride than some of our previous chapters.
Yeah. I still enjoyed it.
I'm not hating it, right? We have some more critiques of it than we've had it before, is all that's going on here. And so then we move on to crafting our beverage. Started in 2007. And so he says they seem to have two options for doing it. There's using the pulp and fermenting that, or making the froth with the beans and additives to make it ferment. And they decided to go with a third option on the basis of combining both, on the basis that we don't know they didn't.
Yeah.
Which again, I hate that argument. Like, it can just say because we wanted to.
Right,
That's
because we wanted to, or this was the most, like, the easiest option for us because there was a lot of like...
And it would get us, we thought it would get us some fermentation and some of that frothy, and we thought that would work better for us.
Yeah.
Just say we wanted to. You don't have to like justify it that way. And we talked about, we had a whole book about that argument with Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, and I don't like to see it.
Yeah. And I also feel like, again, and I understand, again, they're making a beer that's supposed to be consumed by the general audience, blah, 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 blah. But they, again, kind of mixed periods and cultures and sites and like gathered all this information and just kind of like threw it together. And then they were like, we couldn't get the pulp because the pulp would spoil. We couldn't only get like chocolate powder from a U.S. distributor, and we used flake corn, and then
they used nibs and powder, and he said the nibs weren't pulp, but they carried the sensory imprint of its fermentation.
Yeah.
But as far as I can understand, nibs are just like cracked chocolate beans.
Yeah.
So I don't understand that statement.
Yeah. And then the Delaware wildflower honey.
Oh, I want to go back to, you mentioned the corn, because that setup was like the biggest setup to the worst conclusion. Because he's like, so maize was important, and even today there's a lot of groups that use maize in their chocolate things, and that sounds fascinating, delicious. I want to try it. So he talked about, well, we could chew it, we could get a Mexican variety and do a whole bunch of experimental archaeology and grow it, and everything. But we just use cornflakes.
Yeah.
And just like it was being presented as like we could go to this great lengths to do it, or we could use cornflakes. There's like nothing in between. It's like
Right.
there's American varieties of maize you could have used. Like and again, maybe that wasn't practical, but it's weird the way it's presented and the way it was built up is it's like, oh, I want to hear about this. I want to hear about this.
It started to almost feel rushed.
Yeah.
Like he went into a lot of detail about like stuff in early on, and then at the end when it comes to making the beer, it almost seemed like a completely different flow.
Well, and just the buildup to that bothered me. And cornflakes, like really, you couldn't find a better option than cornflakes.
And then
whatever.
And I think it's like flaked corn, not like the cereal. So
well, he said flaked corn from a popular brand. That was my so that was or like a big brand cornflakes.
It was from a large American distributor,
right?
So.
Which is why I concluded it might have been cornflakes, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
I feel like it was probably just like in my mind I had it almost like not like grits, but like something like that.
Well, still modern corn. I feel like you could have stepped back from that a little.
At least in a cool variety.
And again, you don't have to, right? But you could just say we felt this important, but we did think it was practical.
Yeah,
that's
and then
fine.
Of course they added the hops to comply with laws and regulations.
Yep, which is fine. We talked about that before.
Yep, gotta comply with that.
And they had a lot of options for additives, and they decided to go with dried poblano pepper, which sounds interesting.
Yeah, I've had like spicy, like peppered chocolate with pepper in it and stuff like that, and it's really good. It's a good combination. You get that kind of savory, sweet, spicy.
Yep.
But then like again with the yeast.
With the yeast.
German ale yeast, and I'm just like,
yeah,
I don't know. There's so many different cool like yeast varieties out there, and so I just feel like
maybe in 2007 they weren't as widely available.
That's true. Maybe
right?
not.
Maybe
I don't know.
I'm trying to give them a little credit here, and also like you said before, this is something that's supposed to be something they're selling for profit.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily for pure science.
I am glad they decided to go with a name other than Montezuma's Revenge.
Yeah. Well, so this bugged me a little bit too. After they added all the ingredients, they made it red because blood and human sacrifice.
Well, and what was weird to me is they decided, well, I think the one that they discussed making it red, and they made like one red for them, and they decided against it because they were like, a red beer might not be, palatable to the general public. And I was like, it's funny because the brewery that I work at, we have a red beer that's seasonal, and it's colored with beets.
Yeah.
And people will come in, they know what season it's supposed to come in, and they will come in, they want the red beer, the red beer, the red beer. And so I was
Again, we got to remember this was 2007.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
So it's like, wow, how things may have changed.
Right. Also, I thought about kind of why it bothered me that they did this a little bit. And this kind of actually connects back to issues we had with Four Lost Cities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's going on here and why it bothers me is because they're representing the human sacrifices on our terms and not on the terms of the culture that may have practiced these things.
Yeah, and there wasn't, I guess there was a little bit of discussion about, people would be given chocolate before they were sacrificed or whatever.
Yeah.
But I don't feel like I'm glad they decided against it in this case because.
But it wasn't for the reasons I would have liked them to.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was for the palatable reasons, not necessarily like the cultural sensitivity.
Well, I want to connect again to, I don't have the quote on hand, but Stealing History had a really good section where the author there presents the human sacrifices of the culture he's talking about very much on the terms of the culture that he's talking about. And he did such a good job that, frankly, a lot of archaeologists could probably learn from that, including myself. I think it was really stood out. And so these situations where they are doing kind of the opposite, presenting it by our modern standards at least, do kind of stand out in contrast.
And I feel like it's always like, oh, wow, they had human sacrifice, or oh my gosh, how could they?
Right.
And it's like,
or look at how horrible this was,
right?
And look at how these poor victims, and that wasn't always the case,
right? And
we cannot assume that.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm glad they went with a beer other than the red colored beer, but it wasn't for the reasons that I would have liked.
Yep.
Because I know for a fact people will drink a red beer, so it doesn't matter. But people wouldn't have that nuanced understanding of the color. So, yeah.
So, yes, like you were getting to, I think, before I cut in with that, they went with the name of Theobroma, which translates as food of the gods. There is a little talk about the difficulties of the froth, because froth was important, they think, at least, to this process, but they weren't getting the froth they wanted, and then also it just would have made bottling a complete nightmare, which I totally understand. He does use the terms old world and new world a lot here, which again, I'm not wild about.
But in the context of
When he was writing it, I could see that
Yeah.
being a little more common. It's surprising how fast that's gone out of fashion, though. And then he sampled a couple of versions, and the first version he thought wasn't chocolatey enough. And so I think Sam, like, well, you want chocolate, you're going to get chocolate. And I guess the second one was so chocolatey, he's like, we'll go with the first
Yeah.
one. Which I liked.
Yeah, the chapter was, and I get to, like, that was like the history he was having to cover. Something I tried to keep in mind as to prevent myself from getting too annoyed is, you talk about Mayan, Aztec, Olmec, and all these other, like, South and Central American cultures. That's a lot to kind of throw into one chapter that's not even the main focus. It's the beer.
And unlike sometimes in the past, he's not confusing these cultures.
Right.
He is keeping them straight and talking about them in their own context, which I thought was very well done on that part.
Yeah.
Because it is complicated, but if you're writing a book about it, you should keep that straight. And he did.
Yeah.
So props there. So next chapter, chicha, chewing our way to corn beer. And so this one is all about the chicha drink, which is a corn beverage in South America, and we'll get into details about that. Once again, we start off with a really weird preamble. And so I had a moment, I was like, all right, I just need to sit down and kind of try and write out this train of thought that he's doing here. And so here's what I came up with. People ate meat, and we thought they came to the Americas following the megafauna, but they came to the Americas for the plants, and he acknowledges a pre-Clovis. Humans sometimes have a gentler side because they don't eat a lot of plants. Clovis first is bad because human teeth are built for plants, but not for grains. And for grains, we developed enzymes in our saliva to help us process grains. And that last statement about the enzymes is what he wanted to say.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of that was entirely unnecessary and also really questionable. It was just like, what is going on here?
Yeah. Again, I feel like it was not necessary. It was kind of an information overload.
But
and
it just, you could have said, our teeth are designed for plants, but grains are harder for us to process.
So we have an enzyme.
Right. There you got your whole thing right there. Yeah. Anyway, we move on to some more solid stuff, talking about some cave sites where they found what are called, I'm going to say, quids, which are basically chewed wads of plant material that someone has spit out.
Yum.
Right. And so essentially the idea is that you can get a lot of sugar from these materials with our special enzymes, essentially, which is what they were probably after most of the part. And actually, I don't know where he talks about this exactly, but he talks about how actually parts of the corn plant actually do have a lot of sugar. And back in Nebraska, we would work in the cornfields sometimes. There's the flowery tassel on the part, and we were pulling that out for a job. And I don't know who figured this out, but at the very end of that tassel is actually a fairly tender bit and watery bit of the plant. And you can just bite that off, and it's kind of sweet, tastes like corn, has a lot of water in it. So like, this is the modern plant, of course, not these ancient plants, but I thought that was interesting personal connection to that situation.
He does talk a little bit about like the history and kind of the evolution of maize, which I hadn't really thought or read about that since like undergrad. So I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. Forgot about that. So that was kind of a fun read.
And he does kind of a little bit reestablish that, we are programmed to seek out alcohol, but he also did that very thoroughly, I think, earlier in the book. So he didn't spend too long on it though, but I thought that was a good callback to earlier in the book, really. He also talked about how it was interesting that Americans gravitated towards corn at all because your wild corn is not very interesting. It looks like a grain.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't seem like it'd be that special.
Yeah, it is. I never really thought about that. You learn that corn was important, but you don't necessarily take it to the next step as to like how, like, why did we look at this plant and decide that's the plant we're going to eat that?
It was so wildly different
Yeah.
from even like the older forms of maize and such.
Yeah.
Like, this was not at all the same looking plant. It just looked like wheat or barley or something.
Yeah. I guess it was maybe prevalent. No.
We moved to Machu Picchu and talked kind of about corn cultivation and this kind of a thing there. I did like when he talked about Machu Picchu, said it was abandoned at one point, and then he said, in quote, resurfaced, end quote, at another time with archaeologists led by native guides.
Yeah.
I'm like, good, well done. That's really well handled because it very clearly said, resurfaced in a certain context, and then native guides knew it was there already. So good job. I like that. Archaeology books for fun, stamp of approval on that statement.
Yes, for sure, for sure.
And so then we have the part of the chapter, they didn't get this really last time, but the part of the chapter where the author visits the area and tours the area.
Which I thought I enjoyed it because especially in this chapter, it provided a lot of like ethnographic information about how, again, the women processed the corn both historically and modern. I kind of like the bits where the women were like, because I guess a lot of times chicha in these chicherias, I hope I'm saying that right, which are like bars where you drink chicha, they don't chew the quid anymore. They process it and
they sprout it first.
Yeah.
Which we talked about before.
And but some of the women are like, don't tell my husband, but yeah, I chew it.
Or they do it for like special ceremonies and that kind of thing. It's not like what they serve the customers necessarily.
But I thought it just adds kind of a human. I could just see like a group of women in the back being like, yeah, we do what's easiest.
Or gets the best result, I think. Because it seems like they're establishing in this chapter that it does get maybe better results.
Yeah, I guess especially women, we have more of that enzyme or something, or the enzyme works better.
I'd be curious on how rigorously they tested that, but it is an observation they made at the very least.
Yeah. So.
Because they tested it themselves later, kind of.
Yeah, girl power.
Yeah. So yeah, he drinks a bunch of chicha and talks to a bunch of brewers and talks about their processes. And it was very good. He talks about one called chicha de mole, which was interesting to me because it's done with a pepperberry. And here's when I noted, and I think he's been doing this throughout the book, but it stood out because we're in the same area as a previous book that didn't do this. He names the people he talks to.
Yes.
So he names the husband and wife pair, in this case, he talks to that's doing the brewery and the pepperberry. And like, it's not that hard.
Yeah, it's much more pleasant. Ooh, and going back, I also want to mention, because it's something I find fascinating. So when he was in these chicherias, he describes them, they're colorful, and over the door, they sometimes have a broom, which is used a lot in Europe, or was used historically to indicate like a tavern for beer. And women were traditionally the brewers a lot of times. And so a lot of our like traditional witch iconography, like the Halloween witch with the stirring the cauldron and she's riding a broom and stuff like that, and the big hats, comes from women brewers, potentially. So I just wanted to mention that because it's a cool little factoid.
Yeah. Is it a potential thing or is it an actual?
Some of it, it's hard to prove, right? But it seems to come from that.
I mean, it makes logical sense at least. Yeah.
Because like it's one of those, it's kind of like this weird evolution of like women's history. There's been whole books written about it.
Yep. And then we move down into the Amazon jungle, and he basically does a whole bunch of sampling and notices like all the different kinds of fruits there and everything. Interestingly, he describes it as a jungle paradise, and once again, it names a local that he talks to, in contrast to another book in particular that we have read.
Yeah, it is funny because this is, jungle paradise, and there's people here, and there's people thriving here.
And this is one of the people I talked to.
Yes, it is such...
It was very nicely done.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be something notable, but it is now.
Yeah, exactly.
We talk about some of the history of chicha, and I think the summary for this is like, goes back 5,000 years and is very, very important culturally and socially and religiously and all kinds of different things. So lots of stuff tied to it.
Yeah, to me, it was parallel to like the chocolate, like the cacao. There was I saw a lot of similarities between how important cacao was and how important chicha was. Not the same beverage.
I think there's,
but there's a lot of like overlap.
I think there's overlap even with other cultures around the world, not necessarily on the same scale. So they are getting ready once again to make the chicha, and this time they're dedicated to chewing to make the beverage.
I did think it was interesting in this chapter, though, that like the ceramics didn't really come into play as much. I guess they had a lot of ceramics at the Penn Museum, but the provenience was just like suspect, and there was a lot of issues with it.
Yeah, they didn't know where it came from exactly.
Yeah.
So they decided to import purple corn from South America and pepperberries, because I guess there are some sites with strong indications of pepperberries. Use local wild strawberries, and I think they said this time cornflakes, but they didn't capitalize it. So it could be flaked corn again.
Yeah, I feel like you couldn't really use corn flakes like the
processed,
cereal because it's so processed and there's sugar added and other preservatives and stuff like that added.
I think your interpretation of what he's trying to say there is probably better. And then a bit of barley and hops. Barley malt and hops.
Gotta get those hops
Gotta get
in
them in
there.
there. And I like this. They organized a chewing event where they all chewed for 8 hours, and they even had like a news reporter come out
Yeah.
for their chewing event. And apparently about partway through, they decided this is hard work. And so they got out an electric grinder to help them grind it, which I guess people tended to do that with monometate before anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So they chewed their quids and spit it into the mash. And
I think I watched this episode, or I watched something where they were doing this, and it's so gross. Like there was just a bunch of guys spitting, like chewing and like spitting into like a shared like 5-gallon food grade bucket.
Yeah.
It was like, ew.
yeah, and then they emphasized that they did boil it before they added the yeast.
Yeah, and I mean the fermenting and everything like that would essentially sterilize it, especially in like the modern brewing equipment.
Right. Yeah.
I still don't know if I would try it. Would you try it, Tristan?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've eaten weirder, grosser things.
I guess.
Would it be one of my favorites that I'd have all the time? Probably not.
I just have a weird thing with like people like chewing.
Spitting.
Yeah. It's just one of those things, people have their little ick things. That's an ick thing.
Uh-huh. I mean, yeah, I would just not think about that too deeply when I was drinking it. That's how I'd do it for sure. That's my trick. So they were ready in time for the 2009 Great American Beer Festival. And I thought this was funny because once again, the big beer companies complained that their line was too long. This is the second time that's happened.
So this is interesting because I about the time I got into craft beer was around the time everybody was getting really, really mad at big beer. And I looked into this because I was like, wow, he's really like harking on big beer all of a sudden. It just seemed to kind of come out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And like it's really prevalent in this chapter and in the next chapter. And so between like 2009, 2014, big beer was, and I'm not going to mention any companies, but if you're into craft beer, you know who they are, and I'm sure you hate them.
Probably not even in the US, you know who we're talking about.
Yeah. So they saw a decline in sales, and they attributed that to customers' evolving preferences for craft beer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they started focusing on importing popular foreign beers, and around that time, they acquired craft breweries as well. And so a lot of people would, like if a craft brewery sold out, and I use that in quotes, to big beer, they would be like condemned, It was a big deal. But when you think about it as a craft brewer, you're like, wow, I just made all this money on my beer. So, you have to kind of look at it both ways.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like a lot of craft breweries are kind of living moment to moment a little bit more than some other businesses.
Yeah.
So.
And so this was around the time when they also, one company in particular acquired like Grupo Modelo, which is who makes Modelo. It's a Mexican beer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it happened around the time that he was writing about this chicha, which chicha is a brew in Mexico.
Right. And South America.
And South America, but very prevalent in Mexico. And this happened, I think, in like 2013. And there was a big, big concern with the Department of Justice regarding antitrust issues with Modelo. Eventually, it happened. It's the whole thing. So I just feel like that coincided with the writing of this book, specifically when they were making this beverage.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like at the forefront in like the craft beer industry. So I feel like that's why it's very prevalent in the next chapter. But I remember when it was happening, and it's funny because, I've heard people that are in the craft beer industry say, look, like getting bought up by one of these companies in some ways is kind of the goal,
right?
Because they have the distributor, they have the ability for these craft beers to make a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
So, you got to look at it both sides. And I know this will probably get some comments.
If you have opinions, let us know.
Yeah. So, and it's changed. And guess what? The craft beer industry is still doing well and good. And
probably better even than at this point.
Big beer has not killed it.
Right.
So it's all good.
Yeah. Last chapter?
Yeah.
All right. So last chapter, what next? A cocktail from the New World. Anyone? This, I was expecting a conclusion, and it's kind of not a conclusion.
Yeah, this was a
weird way of ending it.
Yeah.
It I can see a little why, but it also just didn't wrap up.
It didn't wrap up anything.
Like
there is no wrap up. Like I wanted like
it does a little.
Kind of.
But yeah, it was odd. And well, I wanted to say that it felt like a lot of this book was unfocused, and a lot of it kind of is, but he had a very clear introduction with some very clear like structure to that and ideas, and he did talk about those ideas. So yeah. I feel like this is where you reiterate those ideas.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree.
Oh, well. He talks at first a little bit about what a good partner Sam Calagione is,
Mm-hmm.
and
I
how
do like the relationship between the two of them.
yeah, that
It
was
was
a lot
a
of
good
fun.
partnership.
And how he's willing to push back against the norms and try things, and how beneficial that was. Then he talks. This is the little part that is kind of the conclusion. Like he talked about what is in the works and how like essentially neither of them are willing to talk about that to people who are just curious, unless they're like professionally involved in it some way, because a lot of reasons it may not happen, or someone might steal their ideas or that kind of a thing.
And especially, I mean, that makes sense not only in the academic world, like in Pat's world of doing the research and stuff like that. You want to be the one who publishes on your work and does the research, but also from a business standpoint,
Probably
Dogfish.
even more so in the business
Yeah,
standpoint. 'Cause
Dogfish, it's like, I don't want someone stealing my
like,
potential beer idea.
his position in the academic world is someone else would have to have the facilities, and there's not that many that would, but whereas there's lots of breweries out there that could easily, steal some of your ideas or grab on them.
Yep.
But yeah, so then we move on to something that is in the works. And essentially this is interesting because there's indication that in Mexico there may have been someone using agave to make very high alcohol content beverages.
Yeah.
22%. And so they're looking at the ceramics in this case to see that, and then they tested it out and they got really high alcohol content. Oh, sorry, the experimental archaeology got 22.5% alcohol content. So it's interesting, but they needed, again, someone to kind of verify that there's agave present or that kind of a thing. And it doesn't seem that he tested it yet, though.
Not yet. It seems like I had to do a lot of research on the difference between like mezcal and tequila.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the difference was. And so I was like, so in order to read and understand this chapter, I had to kind of take a step back from it and just do a lot of Googling.
So what is the difference?
All right. So get out my notes here. Yeah, because I was kind of confused on the difference between, I know he talks about pulque, which I guess we can get into a little bit, but as far as tequila and mezcal are concerned, tequila is a type of mezcal, but must be made from the blue agave, which is found in only a particular region in Mexico. Mezcal can be made from any agave and is found in a wider geographical area. Mezcal often has a smoky flavor from roasting the agave hearts. And then pulque is made from fermenting, so it's not a distilled product. So mezcal and tequila are distilled, they're liquor, but pulque is made from fermenting the sap of the agave, whereas, mezcal and tequila, I guess, are from the hearts of the agave plant. Okay. And pulque is milky, viscous, slightly sour, and yeasty tasting.
Yeasty. I don't know about yeasty, but otherwise I was interested.
Because I was confused because I got confused between like the three different types of beverages and then what was being fermented and what was being distilled and who was doing what. So I had to kind of go back and regroup.
Yeah. Yeah. So he talks about pulque a bit more and how it's actually becoming very popular in Mexico City, or at least at that time, which is kind of cool that it would have a cultural comeback, I guess.
Yeah.
So they decided they were going to try to do their own. And again, this feels like they start with some very big ideas and they just said, no, we're not going to do that. So apparently some of these were done in basically canoes. Some of this brewing was. And so they were like, let's go get some brewing canoes. And they decided that wasn't practical. So they just used modern facilities.
Yeah. Yeah. It would have been cool to at least do like a little small batch maybe. Or did he go down to Mexico?
Someone did.
Yeah.
And thought was maybe going to buy some, but they were falling apart. And then how do you get them through customs and everything?
Yeah.
So they gave up on that.
But I would have liked to have learned more about that. I feel like going more into depth regarding that would have been really cool.
And was it literally canoes, or it was just a hollowed out log that they had handy? And sometimes that would be a canoe, right?
Right.
I don't know. So yes, they did their distillation and they resulted in 50% alcohol. And then it was cut down to something a little more reasonable with a few other processes afterwards. And then they did 3 versions of it and took it to the World Science Festival in 2015.
Which I didn't even know that was a thing. Right. I want to go to the World Science Festival.
And drink beer and
learn all the nerdy things and meet all these different types of science nerds. That sounds like a great time.
And yeah, that's kind of where I end up. Do you have anything else to throw in there? Because it has a little bit more, but it's just kind of like it wraps things up a little bit at the very end without adding anything new that I felt needed to be shared necessarily.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me was learning the difference between all the liquors.
Which the book didn't help you with.
No.
It just confused you enough you had to look it up.
Because I was like, it just seemed like I was like, wait, are they distilling this or fermenting this. And then I was like, wait, I thought people prior to European contact didn't really distill.
I think that was the interesting thing, is that if this was distilled, then that's very interesting.
Yeah. So I just felt like there was a lot of stuff in this chapter, and maybe it's because there's stuff still in the works or something, but it seemed kind of like brushed over that I was like, but that's interesting. Tell me more.
Maybe has a bit of it's maybe a bit like some of the other chapters and a little confusing maybe, and then it's more so because it's not finished.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Just possible there.
I wish, because one thing I felt like was lacking in this book was obviously fermented beverages are kind of the tie-in, but I wish there was more of a thread throughout the book that kind of tied all of these together. Like, why did he pick these specific regions, and what are the similarities and the differences, and both the beverages but also culturally. And then I think that would have provided like a good kind of foundation for a wrap-up chapter, a conclusion.
Yeah.
And not having that, I was just kind of left sitting there like, okay.
I think, like I said last episode, or maybe I just thought this so far, this book fits into the same category for me as Lost City of the Monkey God. But one of them is example of a good book that I enjoy, and one of them example of a book I do not enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
But it really feels a lot like these are some fun stories I have to tell.
Right. Yeah, right? Which is fine, and there's definitely a place for that.
And it's enjoyable enough to read. Like but that structure doesn't necessarily lend to a focus for to kind of help your audience kind of find a through thread to kind of anchor themselves to.
And there was really, the way to organize it is definitely by beer, right?
Mm-hmm,
or by beverage, excuse me. Right. But it would have been really cool if there was at least, even if it was like his personal travels, like those little personal stories that we get, if he could have tied those together as more of like a fluid narrative throughout the book, I think it would have been really cool.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he could have, but
maybe, because he does kind of have them organized. Like we observed, like now we're in the travel portion of the chapter.
Yeah.
And then I think sometimes he also tried to connect things, and then the effort didn't quite work like he intended.
Yeah.
We've rented that a few times. So anyway, not to harp on it.
I really enjoyed this book overall. I thought now I know the difference between tequila and mezcal. Some of my friends will be so proud of me.
And really, if you are interested in fermented beverages and the past, 100% read this book.
And I think it's really cool that he provides the home brewing recipes as well as food pairing recipes. Like if you're a home brewer and you are also a history nerd, this is the book for you. Mm-hmm. And if you do make some of these beverages, let us know how they turn out, or some of the food as well.
Yeah. So I guess we're kind of taking a little more of a negative spin on this one this time, but I want to emphasize that we did enjoy the book.
Yeah, for sure.
It has some faults in this chapter, but compared to some of the books we've read where we had major problems with in the past, these aren't major problems.
And there's there's other books out there too. Like I think it wasn't quite what I expected, because I've read other books about the history of beer. And so I think I was kind of thinking it would be more like that. But then that's not really what this is. It wasn't what I necessarily expected, but I really, really enjoyed it. And I think he did a good job too of picking, him and Sam, of picking different cultures that not only were the cultures really, really different, their beverages were as well. So it kind of gives you a good kind of overview of,
and including local voices
in
their efforts, and in the book and in their efforts to replicate them was also very good. And like we observed several times, they did a good job with that. So,
and tying in the archaeology, the ethnographic information, he looks at it from multiple angles to try and get a really good idea of what's going on. He couldn't always make that happen in reality due to like modern regulations and stuff like that. Right. But he also does a good job of explaining that, which I appreciate, because you could look at that and be like, well, why didn't he do that? If that sounds really cool, why didn't you do that? So I could see people criticizing him for that, but you can't.
All right. So I think that concludes Ancient Brews. Let us know in the comments what you think. If you have any opinions, if you are a lover of sours and want to tell Barbara that you love sours, you go right ahead.
And
be nice, of course, but you can do it.
Explain in detail why.
Yeah.
Because why?
So for our next book, we are going to read Finders Keepers, A Tale of Archaeological Plunder and Obsession by Craig Childs. And this one could be interesting. We haven't done one focused on looting issues for a while, and the reviews seem to kind of be all over the place on whether or not this is good, or some are unhappy with it, but they may be overly academic in their expectations. So we'll see. I'm cautiously optimistic, but yeah, don't know what to expect from this one just yet. So yeah, we're going to start off with that one next time. And just a reminder once again, if you made it this far into the podcast, please have a look at the survey in the show notes. We would really, really appreciate getting any feedback from anyone who listens to us. And if you have friends and family that haven't listened to us too, send it their way, because we're looking for feedback from anyone who will talk to us about it.
Yeah.
I think that wraps us up.
Yeah. So as always, happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.